In medieval Europe, the mind was not seen as a fragile system shaped by experience, chemistry, or trauma. It was not a place of hidden wounds or emotional injury. Instead, it was understood through religion, morality, and superstition. The human body could become sick, injured, or deformed, but the inner thoughts and emotions of a person were believed to be reflections of their spiritual state. If your thoughts were dark, your faith was weak. If your fear consumed you, God was testing you. And if your behavior became strange or uncontrollable, then something external, and often evil, was assumed to be at work. There was no medieval equivalent of the term mental health. There were no categories separating sadness from illness or fear from disorder. Emotional suffering existed, but it was rarely treated as a medical condition. Instead, it was moralized. A person who withdrew from society, stopped eating, or lost interest in daily life might be described as melancholic, a vague and ancient term inherited from Greek medicine. Melancholy was believed to be caused by an excess of black bile, one of the four bodily humors thought to govern all health. But this explanation did little to inspire compassion. Melancholy was often associated with laziness, spiritual weakness, or dangerous introspection. Anxiety, as we understand it today, had no name at all. Constant worry, racing thoughts, fear without a clear cause. These were simply parts of life in a violent, uncertain world. Famine, disease, war, and sudden death were ever present, so fear was normalized. If someone could not cope with it, that failure was personal, not medical. A person plagued by panic might be told to pray harder, confess more often, or endure silently as a test of faith. Depression was especially misunderstood. Prolonged sadness was frequently labeled as aesthesia, sometimes called spiritual sloth. Aesthesia was considered a deadly sin, particularly among monks. It described a state of deep weariness, emotional numbness, and loss of purpose, symptoms that closely resemble modern clinical depression. But instead of receiving care, those suffering were often blamed for failing God. Their pain was interpreted as a lack of discipline or devotion, rather than an illness deserving empathy. For those whose mental suffering became visible through erratic behavior, hallucinations, or emotional outbursts, the situation grew far worse. Without psychological explanations, medieval society searched for causes that fit their worldview. Demons, curses, divine punishment, or possession became the default answers. A person hearing voices was not experiencing psychosis. They were believed to be hearing angels or devils. Someone dissociating from reality was thought to be spiritually touched for better or worse. Families often hid mentally unwell relatives, not out of cruelty, but fear. Fear of social shame, fear of religious judgment, and fear of legal consequences. A person labeled dangerous or possessed could be confined, exiled, or handed over to religious authorities. In small villages, reputation was survival, and a mad family member could destroy it. Yet despite the ignorance, suffering was deeply human. Medieval letters, poems, and religious writings reveal people describing crushing despair, unbearable guilt, and relentless fear, even if they lacked the language we use today. They wrote of heavy hearts, restless souls, and minds that could not find peace. The pain was real, even if the explanations were wrong. Mental health in medieval times was not absent. It was everywhere, woven into daily life, but unseen, unnamed, and often punished rather than healed. And for many, this misunderstanding marked the beginning of a long and quiet descent into isolation in medieval society. Religion was not a separate part of life. It was life itself. Every thought, emotion, and action was filtered through a spiritual lens, and this made mental suffering especially difficult to escape. Pain of the body could be prayed over, treated with herbs, or accepted as fate. Pain of the mind, however, carried a heavier burden. It was not just suffering, it was suspicion. To struggle internally was often seen as evidence of spiritual weakness, hidden sin, or a fractured relationship with God. The church taught that the soul was the true center of a person, and that emotional turmoil reflected the state of that soul. If you felt persistent fear, it might be because you doubted God's protection. If you felt despair, it could mean you had lost faith in divine mercy. Guilt, intrusive thoughts, and obsessive fears were interpreted not as symptoms, but as moral failures. This belief turned inner pain into something shameful, something to hide or confess rather than understand. One of the most damaging ideas was the belief that prolonged sadness was spiritually dangerous. Medieval theologians warned that despair itself was a sin because it implied a lack of trust in God's plan. To feel hopeless was not only painful, it was believed to threaten eternal salvation. For someone experiencing depression, this created a cruel loop. The worse they felt, the more sinful they believed themselves to be. And the more sinful they felt, the deeper their despair grew. Monasteries offer some of the clearest written records of medieval mental suffering. Monks lived lives of silence, repetition, isolation, and constant self-examination. While some found peace, others slowly unraveled. They wrote about crushing boredom, emotional emptiness, and a sense that time itself had stopped. This state, aesthesia, was described as a spiritual sickness that attacked the soul during long afternoons, draining all motivation and joy. Today, many historians recognize it as a close cousin to depression and burnout. But medieval monks were told to fight it through stricter discipline, harsher routines, and deeper self-denial, approaches that often made things worse. Prayer was the primary response to mental distress. Those who suffered were encouraged to pray longer, fast more intensely, and confess more frequently. Confession, in particular, played a complex role. On one hand, it could offer relief, a moment of being heard. On the other, it reinforced the idea that distress came from sin. A person confessing anxious or intrusive thoughts might be told they were tempted by the devil, and that resistance, not care, was the solution. For severe cases, religious rituals escalated. Exorcisms were sometimes performed on individuals experiencing hallucinations, dissociation, or uncontrollable behavior. These rituals were not rare or fringe practices. They were accepted responses to what we would now call severe mental illness. While some people may have felt comforted by the ritual, others endured terrifying ceremonies that framed their suffering as a battle between good and evil inside their own body. Women were especially vulnerable under this system. Emotional expression in women was often viewed as excessive or unstable by nature. A grieving woman might be labeled hysterical. A woman experiencing emotional breakdowns could be accused of spiritual corruption or moral weakness. In extreme cases, intense emotional distress could contribute to accusations of witchcraft, especially if a woman behaved unpredictably or withdrew from social norms. Mental suffering became dangerous not only to the individual, but to their very survival. There were moments of compassion, but they were limited. Saints who experienced visions, voices, or extreme emotional states were sometimes revered rather than punished. The difference was interpretation. If suffering aligned with religious ideals, it could be sanctified. If it did not, it was condemned. This thin line meant that two people with nearly identical experiences could be treated in radically different ways. One as holy, the other as cursed. For most medieval people, there was no concept of recovery. You did not heal from mental suffering. You endured it, prayed through it, or broken by it. The goal was not balance or well-being, but obedience and salvation. And in a world where eternal consequences loomed larger than earthly comfort, the mind became a battleground where mercy was rare and misunderstanding was constant. When mental suffering in medieval times could no longer be explained away as temporary sadness or spiritual weakness, it entered a far more frightening category. This was the realm of madness, a word used not to describe a condition, but a loss of control. Madness meant unpredictability, danger, and disorder, all things medieval society deeply feared. A person who crossed this invisible line was no longer simply struggling. They were seen as broken in a way that threatened everyone around them. There was no clear boundary between eccentricity and insanity. Someone who talked to themselves, laughed at inappropriate moments, or behaved erratically might be tolerated for years if they were harmless. Many villages had a local fool or simpleton, often protected by community familiarity. But once behavior became disruptive, violent, or incomprehensible, tolerance vanished. Fear replaced patience, and fear demanded containment. Confinement was one of the most common responses. Families might lock a mentally unwell relative in a room, cellar, or shed, not necessarily out of cruelty, but desperation. There were no doctors to call, no institutions designed for care. Isolation was seen as protection for the individual and for society. In some cases, people were chained, restrained, or kept in darkness for long periods. These measures were believed to calm the mind by controlling the body, though they often intensified distress, by the late Middle Ages. Early forms of institutions began to appear, though they bore little resemblance to modern hospitals. Places like Bethlehem Hospital in London, later infamous as Bedlam, housed those considered insane. Conditions were harsh, overcrowded, and deeply dehumanizing. Patients were not treated with therapy or medicine, but with restraint, neglect, and public spectacle. Visitors sometimes paid to observe the inmates, turning mental illness into entertainment and reinforcing the idea that madness was something to be feared rather than understood. Legal systems also played a role. Medieval law recognized madness primarily in terms of responsibility. If a person committed a crime while out of their mind, they might be spared execution, but not freedom. Instead, they were confined indefinitely, often without review. Madness became a life sentence. Once labeled, it was nearly impossible to escape, regardless of whether the condition improved. Violence toward the mentally ill was not uncommon. People believed that harsh treatment could drive out demons or force the mind back into order. Beatings, cold water immersion, and physical restraint were used as supposed cures. These practices were not fringe beliefs. They were grounded in the idea that madness was an external force that needed to be expelled through physical means. Despite this, not all responses were brutal. In some religious communities, individuals experiencing mental suffering were cared for quietly, given food, shelter, and prayer without punishment. These pockets of compassion were inconsistent and fragile, dependent entirely on local attitudes. There was no standard of care, no shared understanding, only individual judgment shaped by fear and faith. The loss of identity was often the most devastating part. A person labeled mad lost social status, legal rights, and often their name. They became a condition rather than a human being. Their thoughts, feelings, and experiences were dismissed as meaningless noise, even when they were expressions of pain, confusion, or trauma. What medieval society feared most was not suffering itself, but unpredictability. A stable hierarchy depended on everyone knowing their place. Madness disrupted that order. It challenged the idea that faith, discipline, and obedience could control the human condition. And so, rather than questioning their beliefs, society removed the problem from view. For those trapped inside this system, there was rarely hope of understanding, let alone recovery. Madness was not something you lived with. It was something you disappeared into. And for many, once the door closed, it never opened again. While religion dominated medieval explanations of mental suffering, medicine was not entirely absent. It existed alongside faith, shaped by ancient Greek ideas that had survived through centuries of copying and reinterpretation. Medieval doctors did not deny mental distress, but they explained it through the body rather than the mind. Emotions, thoughts, and behavior were believed to be governed by physical substances flowing inside the body, and when those substances fell out of balance, the mind followed. At the center of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant excess. Melancholy, the closest medieval concept to depression, was blamed on too much black bile. Anxiety, fearfulness, and erratic behavior might be attributed to an excess of yellow bile or phlegm. These explanations gave suffering a physical cause, but not a compassionate one. The solution was not care or understanding, but correction. Treatments were designed to restore balance, often in ways that weakened the patient further. Bloodletting was common. A person experiencing emotional distress might be bled repeatedly to reduce excess humors, leaving them exhausted, dizzy, and vulnerable. Purging was also popular, using laxatives or vomiting-inducing substances to expel supposed toxins from the body. These methods were painful and dangerous, especially for individuals already struggling mentally. Herbal remedies were prescribed with mixed results. Some plants likely provided mild calming effects, though doctors did not understand why. Others were toxic. Mandrake, henbane, and belladonna were sometimes used to sedate or quiet agitated patients. These substances could induce hallucinations, confusion, or even death. A person seeking relief from mental torment might find themselves plunged deeper into fear and disorientation. Diet was considered essential to mental health. Certain foods were believed to heat or cool the body, affecting emotional states. A melancholic person might be instructed to avoid cold, dry foods and consume warming dishes instead. While these recommendations were gentle compared to other treatments, they still framed suffering as a personal imbalance to be managed rather than an illness to be treated with care. Astrology also influenced medical decisions. Doctors consulted the stars to determine the best times for treatment, believing planetary positions affected the body and mind. If the timing was wrong, even the correct treatment could supposedly fail. This belief placed healing partly outside human control, reinforcing the idea that suffering was tied to cosmic forces beyond understanding. Surgery was rare, but not unheard of. In extreme cases, medieval practitioners attempted trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull to release evil spirits or relieve pressure. This practice had ancient roots and persisted despite its dangers. While some patients may have survived, many did not. For those who lived, there was no guarantee of improvement. The mind remained a mystery, even after the skull was opened. The greatest limitation of medieval medicine was not ignorance alone, but fragmentation. Doctors treated the body. Priests treated the soul. Neither truly addressed the lived experience of mental suffering. A person might be bled by a physician, prayed over by a priest, and confined by their family, all in the name of healing, while their inner pain remained untouched. Access to medical care was also limited. Most people could not afford trained physicians. Folk healers and midwives filled the gap, using traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Some of these practices were gentle and supportive, offering rest, comfort, and community care. Others were steeped in superstition and fear. Outcomes varied wildly, and there was no accountability. In the end, medieval medicine offered explanations, but rarely relief. It acknowledged that something was wrong, but lacked the tools to help. The mind was treated as a secondary problem, a side effect of bodily imbalance or spiritual failure. And for those suffering silently, these treatments often added pain to pain, reinforcing the idea that their distress was something to be endured, not healed. To understand mental health in medieval times, it is impossible to separate the mind from the world it lived in. This was an era where death was not distant or abstract. It was present in homes, in streets, and in fields. Children died young. Plagues returned without warning. Wars passed through villages, leaving hunger and violence behind them. For medieval people, trauma was not an exception. It was the background of everyday life. From childhood, people were exposed to suffering in ways that would be considered deeply traumatic today. Infants died regularly, often without explanation. Parents buried multiple children, sometimes within the same year. There was little time to grieve. Life demanded continuation, not reflection. Emotional numbness was not recognized as a symptom. It was survival. To feel too deeply was dangerous in a world that offered no pause for healing. Violence was public and normalized. Executions were held in town squares. Punishments were designed to be seen, not hidden. Bodies were broken in front of crowds as warnings. For many, especially children, these scenes became early and repeated exposures to extreme violence. Fear, nightmares, and emotional withdrawal would have been common responses, but there was no language to describe them and no space to process them. War left deep psychological scars. Soldiers returned from battle carrying memories of blood, screams, and loss. Some became withdrawn and silent. Others were quick to anger, restless, or unable to reintegrate into normal life. Today, these behaviors would be recognized as signs of post-traumatic stress. In medieval times, they were often dismissed as moral weakness, sinful rage, or failure of discipline. Veterans were rarely supported. They were expected to resume work, provide for families, and remain obedient. Disease added another layer of psychological strain. During plagues, entire communities watched neighbors and family members die within days. The Black Death, in particular, shattered any sense of safety or predictability. People lived with constant fear of invisible death, unsure who would be next. Some turned to extreme religious devotion. Others collapsed into despair or apathy. Chronic fear became normal, and long-term anxiety was simply accepted as part of life. Women experienced unique forms of trauma. Childbirth was dangerous, painful, and often fatal. The constant awareness that pregnancy could mean death shaped emotional lives in quiet, enduring ways. Domestic violence was common and legally tolerated. Grief, fear, and emotional exhaustion accumulated over years, yet women were expected to endure silently. Emotional distress in women was often dismissed as weakness or instability, further isolating those who suffered. Even joy carried anxiety. Good harvests could be followed by famine. Peace could be broken by war. Stability was fragile. This uncertainty trained the medieval mind to expect loss. Hope existed, but it was cautious, restrained, and often placed in the afterlife rather than the present. Despite all this, medieval people found ways to cope. Community rituals, shared labor, and religious festivals offered moments of relief. Storytelling, music, and humor survived even in dark times. These were not cures, but they were buffers, small ways to release pressure in a world that offered no therapy and no understanding. Mental resilience in the Middle Ages was not about healing trauma, but enduring it. Pain was absorbed, normalized, and passed on. Generations lived with unspoken psychological wounds, carrying them quietly through lives shaped by hardship. And while medieval people were no weaker than we are today, the absence of language, care, and support meant that much of their suffering remained locked inside, unnamed and unresolved. Looking back at mental health in medieval times, it is tempting to judge the past harshly. The cruelty, the ignorance, the fear-driven responses, all of it feels distant from modern understanding. But beneath those beliefs lived people who felt the same fear, grief, love, and confusion that we do today. Their suffering was not different in nature, only in explanation. And in that difference, something deeply human is revealed. Medieval society lacked the language to describe the mind as a system that could be injured, overwhelmed, or exhausted. Without that language, suffering was interpreted through the tools available: religion, morality, and superstition. These frameworks provided meaning, but they also imposed blame. Pain became a test, a punishment, or a sign of corruption. And once suffering was moralized, compassion became conditional. Yet medieval people were not heartless. They cared for their families, worried about their futures, and searched desperately for relief. When they prayed, bled, confined, or punished, they believed they were helping. Fear, not malice, guided many of their actions. Fear of chaos, fear of divine judgment, fear of a world already teetering on the edge of disaster. What is striking is how familiar some of their experiences sound. The monk crushed by Astia, the soldier unable to rest, the mother grieving in silence, the villager consumed by fear. These are not relics of the past. They are echoes of modern struggles, stripped of modern vocabulary. Even today, people are still told to endure quietly, to pray harder, to be stronger, to hide their suffering for the sake of order and normality. The medieval world reminds us that understanding the mind is not inevitable. It is a slow, fragile achievement. Compassion had to be learned. Language had to be built. And even now it can be lost. The line between care and condemnation is thinner than we like to believe. Mental health in the Middle Ages was not ignored because people did not suffer. It was misunderstood because suffering was framed through beliefs that could not accommodate vulnerability.